Okay, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the real truth behind 2026 travel nurse pay. Because let's be real, when you're staring at contracts and comparing offers, what you see on the surface, yeah, it's almost never what you actually get. The industry is just completely full of flashy numbers, misleading headlines, and these insanely complex package structures that can trip up even veteran travelers. So today, we're using fresh data from Travel Healthcare Pay to show you exactly how to evaluate your offers, ignore the noise, and really figure out the actual math that dictates your take-home pay.
So you've probably seen the splashy headlines, right? Or maybe you've had recruiters pitch you that $2,161 a week is the quote-unquote national average travel nurse pay for 2026. But look, let's clear the air right off the bat. This is arguably the least useful number you could possibly use when evaluating an actual offer. It gets thrown around constantly on social media, but relying on it totally misses the reality of how we actually get paid out in the real world.
Which brings us to our first point, the national average myth.
Because instead of one single average, the real story actually lives in this massive, typical weekly range of $1,700 to $3,200. And why is there such a huge gap? Well, when you blend wildly different scenarios, like a Med-Surg nurse in rural Arkansas and a highly specialized cath lab nurse in downtown San Francisco, you end up with a completely meaningless midpoint. If you're basing your career expectations on that single $2,000 number, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're either going to severely underprice your in-demand skills and leave thousands on the table, or you're going to take an assignment in a lower-cost market and be completely disappointed when the offer is supposedly below average. We really need to stop fixating on a single dollar amount.
Let's move on to the anatomy of a pay package.
To figure out exactly where you sit in that big range, we have to pull back the curtain on how these contracts are actually built. Every solid travel package has three distinct pieces. First, you've got your taxable base wage. That's your official W-2 hourly rate. Next is your tax-free housing stipend. And finally, your meals and incidental stipend, which you'll usually hear called M&IE. In this example, those three pieces perfectly add up to a $2,430 weekly package. Now, your official W-2 rate is the part the government taxes. But the real magic of travel nursing? That lives in the housing and M&IE stipends. These are tied to the federal GSA Per Diem rates for your specific assignment city. And as long as you maintain a valid tax home, meaning you're actually duplicating your living expenses, those stipends stay completely tax-free. That legally protects a massive chunk of your overall earnings from the IRS. And honestly, it's exactly how travel nurses build wealth so fast.
But hey, you have to be incredibly careful here. If your taxable base rate looks suspiciously low, like say under $15 to $18 an hour for an RN, that is a massive red flag. This is what's known as wage recharacterization. Sure, it might look amazing on paper to have these giant tax-free stipends, but if an agency is artificially dropping your hourly wage just to pump up those stipends and avoid paying their own share of payroll taxes, you are the one taking on the risk. Getting caught up in this can put you in seriously hot water with the IRS if you ever get audited. Plus, having a tiny W-2 income totally wrecks your borrowing power if you ever want to buy a house or get a car loan.
Okay, moving right along to the gross pay trap.
Misunderstanding those tax-free stipends leads directly into this next danger zone. Imagine you're staring at two different offers. Your brain instantly wants to pack up for the West Coast because you see this flashy California contract offering $3,000 a week gross. Right next to it is a Texas contract for $2,400 a week gross. On paper, California wins by a landslide, right? Well, it sounds absolutely crazy until you sit down and do the localized math. But that California deal can actually leave you with less money in your pocket every single Friday than the Texas contract. Gross pay is basically an illusion until you factor in the realities of the market you're stepping into.
This trap happens because, yes, higher-paying states drive up the gross headline rate, but progressive state income taxes and insane local housing costs completely eat away at your actual net profit. That $600 difference on paper, it literally evaporates the second you hand over a huge chunk of your base wage to California state income taxes, and then have to pay double or triple for a furnished studio apartment compared to Texas, which, by the way, has zero state income tax. You absolutely must calculate the final take-home math. It's really not about what you make, it is 100% about what you keep. If you ignore the local cost of living, your bank account growth could end up being way slower, even though you're working the exact same 36-hour week.
Next up, let's talk about specialties and contract tiers.
Beyond just where you go, the exact job you do is your absolute biggest leverage point. Cost of living is huge for sure, but your clinical expertise dictates your ultimate ceiling here.
Specialty alone can shift your weekly pay by $300 to $800. Roles like cath lab, CVOR, ICU, OR, and labor and delivery, they regularly blow past that $2,500 mark. Meanwhile, Med-Surg and telemetry, which, don't get me wrong, is incredibly demanding, backbreaking work, they generally sit in the lower half of the pay range. It really just comes down to hospital supply and demand. Those high-acuity, specialized roles require extensive training and are just harder to fill, so they command a massive premium. Top markets for those critical specialties can easily push well past $3,000 a week when demand spikes.
And then you have to factor in the 3 different contract tiers. First, you've got your standard 13-week assignment. This is the baseline where most travelers operate, usually landing somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000 a week. But then you have the outliers. You know, the ones that produce those viral screenshots you see floating around Facebook and TikTok showing massive weekly payouts. Those are your crisis contracts. They're rapid response needs, often paying $3,500 to $5,000 a week. And finally, you have strike contracts. These happen during hospital walkouts and can easily pay over $5,000 a week for very brief, highly intense periods.
But you have to remember that those astronomical crisis and strike numbers are absolutely not free money. They come with intense and sometimes brutal trade-offs. You might be working with almost zero notice, just jumping into a completely chaotic hospital environment and facing unbelievable professional complexities. You probably won't even get a real orientation. You're walking into a facility that is drowning and they expect you to swim immediately. You're being paid a premium precisely because the working conditions are highly demanding, your flexibility is literally zero, and patient acuity is just through the roof.
All right, let's look at realistic annual earnings.
So, when we pull all these variables together into a 12-month calendar, the taxes, the specialties, the different contract types, what should you actually expect to make in a full year on the road? I mean, while back-to-back $2,500 a week contracts sound amazing and would theoretically gross you $130,000, you aren't a machine, right? The reality of travel nursing is that time off, holidays, and unavoidable licensing delays create necessary gaps in your schedule. If you plan to work 3 13-week contracts, that is 39 weeks. That leaves 13 weeks for vacations and, crucially, for those inevitable 2 to 3 week delays waiting for a hospital to clear a background check or a state nursing board to process a license. Assuming you're going to work 52 straight weeks is just a fast track to extreme burnout and a totally blown financial plan.
What this means is, if you manage your calendar smartly, a highly realistic annual expectation for consistent work is between $100,000 and $140,000. 6 figures is absolutely achievable in this career. It's a fantastic, super lucrative path. If you're in a high-demand specialty and you stay rigorously organized with your licensing, your tax home documentation, and hunting for contracts, hitting that target isn't some pipe dream. It's simply a matter of executing your plan and minimizing the unnecessary downtime between your assignments.
Because gross pay is just the starting point, please do not guess on the math. You should run every single offer you get through the free Pay Decoder tool on Travel Healthcare Pay to calculate exactly what you're going to keep after taxes and expenses. It is an incredibly valuable resource. You just plug in your taxable hourly rate, your housing and meal stipends, your location, and your guaranteed hours. The tool literally does all the heavy lifting for you. It adjusts for state tax rates, your tax home status, and the local cost of living so you can see your true net profit before you ever even sign the dotted line.
So never rely on a national average again. Before you sign your next assignment, you really have to ask yourself, do you truly know the real net value of your contract? Stop looking at the gross headline number and start looking at the breakdown. Run the localized math, account for your specialty, understand the tier of contract you're taking, and step into your next negotiation with total, undeniable clarity. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.